The onset of the coronavirus in India has not only led to widespread repercussions on people's health, but the virus has also affected the Indian economy drastically. With conversations about India's slowdown being prevalent, the question has emerged about the evolution and the reason for the slowdown. While many attribute it only to the pandemic, the truth is that the economic effects of the virus was just the trigger, and the slowdown was actually brewing for quite some time. In fact, the Indian economy has been experiencing a slowdown since 2017-18. Now, the reasons cited by the government for this slowdown have ranged from lower industrial growth to falling private consumption to low global growth. Undeniably, there is validity in all of these claims, but all of them are rooted in one thing, and that is decreasing domestic demand. Today, we're going to talk about the reason behind India's slowdown, the problem of inadequate demand, and what exactly it entails. But first, what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the sum total of private consumption, private investment, government expenditures, and net exports. Now, domestic demand only requires the consideration of the first three, so we'll focus on them. As already spoken about as earlier, India was already facing a slump in private consumption. Furthermore, the slowdown in private investment reached a 16-year low in September 2019, and the government's capital expenditure has been decreasing as a percentage of India's GDP for quite some time now. Inevitably, the decreasing private consumption, decreasing private investment, and decreasing government expenditure led to a fall in demand. To understand what happens due to decreasing demand, let's go back to John Maynard Keynes, a 20th century British economist whose ideas fundamentally altered economic theory. Keynes explained that when demand for goods and services fall, production is adjusted accordingly. To cut costs due to lower production and sales, wages are lowered and people are laid off. As real wages begin to fall and unemployment starts to rise, the people who get affected, that is, the people who lost their jobs and the people whose wages fell, further cut down on consumption. This leads to the economy being entangled in a vicious cycle. The course of this was evident in India way before the pandemic or the lockdown. To see how, let's look at the annual index of industrial production, which basically measures the growth rate of different industries in India. This measure fell from 4.6% in fiscal year 2016 to a negative 0.7% in fiscal year 2019, and this only accounted for a week of the lockdown. Similarly, the unemployment rate, which measures the number of people looking for jobs but unable to find one, rose drastically from 3.81% in May to August of 2017 to 7.52% in September to December of 2019. Thus, the problem India faced prior to the pandemic was of inadequate demand, and thus the only way to get out of this vicious cycle was to stimulate demand. However, the steps taken by the government prior to the pandemic were mostly supply oriented. These included slashing corporate taxes, bank recapitalization and mergers, GST rate cuts, amongst others. Then, given the demand problem was left unaddressed, the onslaught of the virus aggravated it. The lockdown to contain the virus led to closure of all manufacturing units and services that did not cater to essential items. This distress of the Indian economy was thus magnified as a circle of low demand, production cuts, and rising unemployment intensified in the lockdown. As showcased here, the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, which basically indicates the economic health and direction of the manufacturing sector in a country, fell down to 27.4%, and unemployment rate rose to a 23.5% in April 2020 in India, which was the first month of the complete lockdown. While expectations prevailed that the lifting of the lockdown will lead to a rapid V-shaped recovery as supply shocks are eased, that did not happen. Certainly, the indicators recovered a little as the lockdown restrictions eased in May, and manufacturing PMI rose to 47.2% in June, and unemployment rate went down to almost 11% in June. While these figures were an improvement, the recovery was still stunted, given that the pre COVID 19 figures were anyway low to begin with. However, now what is urgent is to stimulate demand, which could be done via numerous measures which directly put money in the hands of people and small firms. Measures like expanding on direct benefit transfers, introducing urban employment guarantee, amongst others, could induce consumption. Thus, it is quite evident that while the pandemic triggered the slowdown in India, it was in motion for quite some time. And the reason for the slowdown was the problem of inadequate demand. To conclude, it is extremely crucial to address the problem of inadequate demand urgently, or it could lead to a prolonged downturn, leading to massive health and economic costs.